I lied about my biggest fear on a quiz show and subsequently won a car and made other contestants lose. The quiz show was called Limits. It was a small syndicated show that aired on a regional channel. The premise was simple: 3 contestants. Each one had to share their biggest fear at the beginning of the show. Throughout the game, the host would design challenges that played on those fears. Whoever was the last contestant standing won a brand new car. I'd been a fan of the show for 6 years. I'd noticed something most viewers hadn't. The producers always designed challenges around the fears contestants shared. If you told them you were afraid of heights, you'd get a balcony. If you told them you were afraid of public speaking, you'd get a microphone in front of a crowd. If you told them you were afraid of spiders, you'd get a glass box with a spider in it. The show was won by the person whose fear was least exploitable, or whose fear they'd lied about. My real biggest fear was something I'd never told anyone: the fear of my own body deteriorating. I'd grown up watching my mother die slowly of multiple sclerosis. I'd watched her lose the ability to walk, the ability to use her hands, the ability to speak. I'd been her primary caretaker for the last 6 years of her life. I'd been terrified ever since that I would get the same disease. I'd been getting regular MRIs for years. I'd seen 4 neurologists. None of them had found any signs, but the fear was always there. I couldn't share that on television, not because it was too private, but because the producers wouldn't have been able to design challenges around it. So I'd known I needed to lie. I'd settled on the fear of small spaces, claustrophobia. It was specific enough to sound real. It was challenging enough to make for good TV. But I knew exactly what they'd design as a challenge. They'd put me in a small box. And the truth is, I wasn't claustrophobic. I'd worked as a hospital nurse for 9 years. I'd been in elevators packed with people. I'd been in MRI machines for hours. I auditioned, I got cast. The taping was scheduled for a Saturday in March. The morning of the taping, I read my biggest fear out loud during a sound check. The producer smiled. He said, "Perfect. Claustrophobia is a great fear. Lots of options." I knew right then I'd made the right choice. The other 2 contestants were named Augustine and Persephone. Augustine was a 40-year-old accountant from Florida. His fear was insects, specifically cockroaches. Persephone was a 28-year-old teacher from Tennessee. Her fear was deep water, specifically being underwater with no way to surface. The first challenge was Augustine's. They put him in a small chamber with 200 Madagascar hissing cockroaches. He had to stay in there for 60 seconds while answering trivia questions. He lasted 41 seconds before he broke and pounded on the door. He was eliminated. The second challenge was Persephone's. They put her in a glass dunk tank. She was lowered slowly into the water while she had to answer questions. She had to last for 45 seconds. She lasted 26. She panicked. She was eliminated. The third challenge was mine. They led me to a clear plexiglass box about the size of a small refrigerator. They told me I'd be sealed inside for 60 seconds while answering trivia questions through a microphone. I climbed in. They sealed the lid. The trivia questions started. I answered all 8 correctly while sitting calmly in the box. The clock ran out. They opened the lid. I'd won. They presented me with the keys to a brand new SUV worth $36,000. I drove it off the lot the next morning. I told my husband Marcus the truth on the drive home. I'd lied. I'd never been claustrophobic. I'd known the producers would try to use my real fears against me. I'd given them something I knew I could handle. Marcus laughed for 10 minutes. He kissed me. He said he was proud of me. I felt good about it for about 2 weeks. Then on a Tuesday in April, I received a letter in the mail from the production company. The letter said, "We have evidence that your stated fear of claustrophobia was inaccurate. We are reviewing potential remedies, including but not limited to retrieval of the prize vehicle. We hired a lawyer." Ariana told me the clause was vague. She told me the burden was on them to prove I'd lied. She told me to gather evidence of times I'd struggled in small spaces. I called my mother's sister. She remembered I'd had a panic attack at 12 in a coat closet during a game of hide and seek. My old therapist still had records from a teenage session where I discussed it. Within 2 weeks, I had documentation of claustrophobia incidents going back 14 years. Ariana sent it to the production company. They quietly dropped the case. I kept the car. Then last week, I got another letter. This one wasn't from the production company. It was from a man named Reginald Vance. He said he'd been investigating Limits for 3 years. He'd received tips that the show had been engaging in unethical practices. He'd been compiling evidence that several contestants had been hospitalized after appearing on the show. He told me he believed I'd lied about my fear. He told me he wasn't going to expose me. He told me he wanted to talk to me about something specific, about a contestant from season 3, a woman who had died 6 months after her episode aired. He believed her death had not been an accident. I sat with that letter for 2 days. I read it probably 15 times. I kept going back to one line. He believed her death had not been an accident. I called him. We agreed on a coffee shop near my house the next afternoon. I didn't tell Marcus. Reginald showed up right on time. He was older than I expected, probably mid-50s, gray hair, glasses. He had a messenger bag and he looked like he hadn't slept well in a while. He sat down across from me. He didn't order anything. He just set his phone on the table between us. "This is a voicemail," he said. "It was left by a contestant from season 3, and she left it for her sister about 3 weeks after her episode was taped." He pressed play. The sound was a little rough, but the voice was clear. A woman. She was crying. Not loud, dramatic crying. The kind where someone is trying to hold it together and failing. She said she couldn't stop having nightmares. She said she hadn't slept in days. Then her voice got quieter, like she was pressing the phone closer to her mouth, and she said, "They told me it would only be 30 seconds. It was almost 4 minutes. I couldn't breathe. I kept screaming and nobody opened the door. My hands went still around my coffee cup." Reginald stopped the recording. He told me the woman's stated fear had been being buried alive. He told me the show's challenge for her was a coffin-shaped box that got lowered into sand. She was supposed to last 30 seconds, but the production team didn't open the box when she started screaming. They kept the cameras going. She lasted 3 minutes and 47 seconds before she passed out inside the box. I looked at him and said, "How did she die?" Reginald leaned back. "Officially, a car accident. Single vehicle. No other cars involved. 6 months after the episode aired." He rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Her sister told me she hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night since the taping. She'd been put on 3 different medications. She'd lost her job. She'd lost 30 pounds. I didn't say anything for a while. I just sat there. The coffee in my hands had gone warm. I won a car. I won a car by lying about a fear I didn't have. And this woman from season 3, she told the the truth. She told them the thing she was most afraid of in the world, and they used it. Reginald watched me for a moment. Then he said, "Did you lie about your fear?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. He waited a few seconds, then he said, "I already know you did. I'm not here to judge you. I'm here because you're the only former contestant who beat them at their own game. You understand how the machine works. I need someone who can explain it from the inside." I said, "I need to think about it." He nodded. He gave me his card and left. I drove home in the SUV. I got in and closed the door and just sat there. I didn't start the engine. Every time I put my hands on the steering wheel, I heard that woman's voice. Nobody opened the door. Marcus was in the kitchen when I walked in. I told him everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "That's not a game show. That's torture." I said, "I know." I spent the next 3 days trying to talk myself out of caring. I told myself this was not my problem. I told myself the woman made her own choices. I was good at telling myself these things. But every time I got in the SUV, I heard her voice. By the third day, I called my Aunt Deirdre, my mom's sister. She'd been there through all of it. The diagnosis, the slow decline, the funeral. I told her everything. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said, "You remember when your mama first got diagnosed?" I said I did. She said, "She told me something." She said the worst part wasn't the disease. The worst part was that people stopped looking at her like a person and started looking at her like a thing that was breaking. That's what you're describing. They looked at that woman and saw content. I started crying right there in the break room. And it wasn't because of the dead woman. It was because I realized I had done the same thing. I sat in the audience area during the taping, and I watched Augustin slam his fists against that door with cockroaches crawling on his neck. I watched Persephone choke on water in that glass tank. I watched 2 real people fall apart in real time. And my only thought the entire time had been, good, that means I'm closer to winning. I wasn't better than the producers. I wasn't smarter than the system. I was part of it. That night, after Marcus fell asleep, I picked up my phone and I called Reginald. I said, "I'll talk to you, but I need to know what you're actually looking for." He told me he had spoken to 11 former contestants. 7 of them reported psychological symptoms after the show. Nightmares, panic attacks, depression. 3 had been hospitalized. 2 had tried to take legal action and had been buried by the company's lawyers. The woman from season 3 was the only one who had died, but she wasn't the only one who had been hurt. He said, "I'm not trying to make a scandal piece. I'm trying to make sure nobody else gets put in a box they can't get out of." I believed him. I told him I would do a recorded interview. Audio only. No camera. No name. We set a date for the following week. That night I told Marcus. He reached over and took my hand. He held it tight. He said, "I'm with you, but be careful. These people already came after you once." 2 days before the interview, my phone rang. It was Ariana, my lawyer. Her voice sounded different. Careful. She said, "I just received a very unusual phone call from the production company's legal team. They want to offer you a settlement, $15,000, in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement that covers all aspects of your participation in the show. They said the offer expires in 72 hours. I was standing in my kitchen. The house was quiet. I could hear the clock on the wall ticking. $15,000, an NDA, out of nowhere. 2 days before I was supposed to sit down and tell Reginald everything I knew, I gripped the edge of the counter. I said, "How do they know I've been talking to anyone?" Ariana was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "That's exactly the right question." I hung up with Ariana and called Reginald. He answered fast. I said, "The production company just offered me $15,000 and an NDA 2 days before our interview. They know I've been talking to you." He let out a long breath, tired. Then he said, "They did this to 3 other people I've talked to. 2 of them took the money. 1 of them didn't. The one who didn't had her episode pulled from the streaming archive within a week. They're trying to erase the evidence." I went to my laptop and searched for the streaming archive. I found my episode. The thumbnail showed my face, smiling, climbing out of the plexiglass box. I took a screenshot. I saved it to my computer. I emailed it to myself. I saved it to a cloud drive. 3 different places. I asked Reginald the thing I had been turning over. "What happens if I do the interview and they find out it was me?" He said, "They'll probably come after the car again. They might try to claim you committed fraud. They'll use the lie about claustrophobia as leverage." I closed my eyes. So they'll punish me for lying about a fear while they were busy traumatizing people with real fears. I called Ariana back. I told her I wasn't taking the settlement. She said, "If you go on record, even anonymously, and they connect it to you, the fraud angle is real. The documentation we sent them was convincing, but it was built on a lie. If they dig deeper, it could unravel." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "So why are you doing this?" I thought about the voicemail, the woman's voice shaking. Nobody opened the door. I said, "Because a woman died and they're pretending it didn't happen." Ariana didn't argue. She just said, "Okay, then we need to be smart. I'll start looking at your exposure." That night, Marcus came home from work. He could tell. He always could. He sat down next to me on the couch. The house was dim. He said, "You could walk away. Keep the car. Forget this." He was just laying it out, the easy road. I said, "I watched 2 people fall apart on that stage so I could win. That woman from season 3, someone watched her scream for almost 4 minutes and they didn't open the door. If I walk away, I'm the person who didn't open the door." Marcus looked at me for a long time. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that isn't agreement so much as acceptance. He reached over and put his hand on my knee. He said, "Then we don't walk away." The audio interview happened 3 days later. Reginald set up in a small rented office space. No camera, just microphones. And I talked. I talked for 2 hours straight. I told him about the audition, how I walked in and said the word claustrophobia and watched the producer's eyes light up like I had just handed him a gift. I told him how the challenges were built, how every single one was calibrated to hit the exact spot where a person would break the fastest. I told him about the contract language, and I told him about me, about the lie, about how I sat in that plexiglass box with my heart beating normal and my hands steady while the audience thought I was being brave. I said, "I gamed it. I figured out the formula and I used it, and I won. And a woman who told the truth about her fear is dead." Reginald was quiet after that. Then he asked me one more question. "Would you be willing to say all of this on camera, with your real name?" I told him I needed to think about it. He nodded. Then he said, "The dead contestant's sister has agreed to be in the documentary. She's going to name the show. She's going to describe the voicemail. She's going to show the medical records. The only thing I'm missing is someone from the inside." The next morning, I called Ariana. I told her I was considering hearing going on camera. She said, "If you publicly admit you lied about your fear, you are handing them the fraud case on a platter. I have to advise you against this." I said, "What if I admit I lied but frame it as evidence of how the show manipulates contestants? That the system is designed so that only liars survive?" Ariana went quiet. Then she said, "That's actually an interesting legal position. If you can demonstrate that the show's structure incentivizes dishonesty because honest contestants are psychologically harmed, your lie becomes evidence of their negligence, not your fraud." That afternoon, I called Reginald. My voice was steady. I said, "I'll do it, on camera, my real name. But I have one condition. You don't frame me as the clever woman who cheated the show. You frame me as the woman who understood the show was designed to hurt people and chose the only way out. And you let the audience decide what that makes me." He said, "That's exactly the story I've been trying to tell." A week later, I sat down in front of a camera. Reginald had the lights set up. The mic was clipped to my shirt. He pressed record. I took a breath. I looked right into the lens. And I said, "My name is Magdalene. I was a contestant on a show called Limits. I lied about my biggest fear. I won a car. And I need to tell you why that should scare you more than anything they put on that stage." The documentary was completed. I didn't hear from the production company for 6 weeks. Then Ariana called. She said the production company was not pursuing the fraud case. They had quietly canceled the show. No new season had been announced. She said, "They don't want discovery. If this went to court, everything Reginald found would become public record. They'd rather lose one car than lose everything." I kept the SUV. A few days later, I drove it to the cemetery where my mother is buried. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. I thought about the woman from season 3 who told the truth about her fear and never recovered. I thought about my mother, who lost her body one piece at a time and never had a choice about any of it. I thought about the box I sat in so calmly, and how the real box I had been afraid of my whole life was never made of plexiglass.